Modern people are taught, almost without realizing it, that vegetables are temporary by nature. You plant them, protect them for a few months, harvest what you can, and then they disappear. Their death feels expected. The garden empties. The soil rests. Next year, you begin again. This rhythm is so familiar that it feels ancient, as if food has always worked this way. But that belief collapses the moment you look backward. For nearly 800 years, much of Europe relied on crops that did not need to be replanted. These vegetables were not seasonal experiments or luxury foods. They were dependable, long-lived staples that returned year after year, often for decades, without being replaced. They fed peasants, monks, towns, and travelers through famine, war, and plague. They were not fragile. They were persistent. The idea that vegetables must die every year is not a law of nature. It is a design choice. In the medieval world, food production existed under constant pressure. Weather was unpredictable. Tools were simple. Labor was exhausting. Failure carried real consequences. In that environment, no one willingly chose systems that required unnecessary repetition. If a plant could survive winter, return in spring, and keep producing without being replanted, it was not seen as unusual, it was valued. These vegetables formed the quiet backbone of food security. They were planted once and expected to endure. Their roots stayed alive underground while frost covered the land. When warmth returned, so did food. This reliability mattered more than speed or novelty. A plant that fed people for 20 years was more valuable than one that produced quickly and vanished. Medieval farmers did not measure productivity the way modern systems do. They did not ask how much a crop produced in a single season. They asked how long it would feed them. Time was part of the calculation. A harvest that returned every year without replanting was a form of stored labor, work already paid for, again and again. This is why replanting every year was not considered normal. It was tolerated only when necessary. Annual crops existed, but they were not the foundation. They filled gaps. They took advantage of good years. The real security came from plants that refused to disappear. These long-lived vegetables changed how people related to land. Gardens were not temporary spaces cleared and rebuilt each spring. They were living systems that matured. Beds settled. Plants earned their place. Soil improved because it was not constantly disturbed. Over time, gardens became easier to manage, not harder. The refusal of these crops to die also changed expectations. When food returned reliably, uncertainty shrank. Communities could survive bad years because something always came back. This did not eliminate hardship, but it softened its edges. It created resilience without requiring constant intervention. What makes this history difficult to recognize today is how completely it was erased. Modern agriculture normalized restarting. It taught that soil exhaustion is inevitable, that crop failure is expected, that buying replacements is simply part of the process. When this pattern repeats for generations, it stops looking like a choice and starts looking like reality. But it is not reality. It is habit. Nature itself favors permanence. In stable ecosystems, perennial plants dominate. They anchor soil, regulate moisture, and create continuity. Annual plants appear mainly where disturbance is constant. Medieval farmers worked with this logic. Modern agriculture often works against it. The disappearance of long-lived vegetables did not happen because they stopped feeding people. It happened because food systems were redesigned around speed, uniformity, and replacement. A plant that fed people for decades did not fit neatly into systems that measured success one season at a time. Over time, these vegetables faded from common use. They were not banned. They were ignored. Knowledge about them stopped being taught. Seeds and divisions stopped being shared. Within a few generations, vegetables that once fed Europe for centuries became obscure, then forgotten. Yet their biology never changed. They did not become weaker. They did not stop growing. They simply no longer belonged to the system that replaced them. This chapter is not about nostalgia. It is about recognizing that food once behaved differently, and that difference mattered. Vegetables that refused to die were not anomalies. They were the foundation of long-term survival. If Europe could rely on these crops for 800 years without replanting, then their disappearance demands an explanation. And once you ask that question, it becomes impossible to ignore a deeper truth. Food did not become fragile by accident. It was redesigned that way. The chapters that follow are not about myth or romanticized history. They are about how these vegetables worked, why they endured, and what was lost when food systems stopped expecting crops to return. Because the most important thing these vegetables provided was not just food, it was continuity. To understand how these crops fed Europe for 800 years, you have to understand the system they lived inside. Medieval food security did not come from individual plants alone. It came from how gardens were designed, maintained, and understood over long stretches of time. These were not casual plots. They were intentional systems built to endure instability. Medieval farmers and monastic communities did not treat gardens as seasonal projects. A garden was infrastructure, as essential as a well or a granary. Once established, it was expected to function through bad weather, labor shortages, and social upheaval. That expectation shaped every decision. Crops were chosen not for speed, but for reliability. Layouts were planned not for convenience, but for permanence. At the heart of this system was the assumption that good food should return on its own. Perennial vegetables anchored gardens because they removed uncertainty. Their roots survived winter underground. Their growth resumed without being replanted. This meant that when spring arrived, food appeared automatically. In a world without guaranteed seed supply or predictable seasons, this mattered enormously. Medieval gardens were designed to minimize disturbance. Soil was not turned every year unless necessary. Beds remained in place. Paths were permanent. Plants were allowed to settle. This stability favored long-lived crops and discouraged weeds that thrive in disturbed ground. Over time, the garden became easier to manage, not harder. The system improved as it aged. Monastery gardens refined this approach to a high level. Monks recorded which crops endured, which failed, and which demanded too much effort. Plants that exhausted soil or required constant replanting were gradually removed. Plants that returned reliably were multiplied through division and cuttings. This was slow selection, guided by results rather than theory. Labor efficiency was central to this design. Medieval life demanded physical work, and there was little tolerance for unnecessary repetition. A crop that required annual reseeding was acceptable only if it provided something essential that perennials could not. Otherwise, it was considered inefficient. The best crops were those that reduced future labor. Seed use reflected this mindset. Seeds were not purchased annually or used to restart entire gardens. They were saved carefully and used selectively. Most propagation happened through roots, crowns, offsets, and cuttings. This preserved reliable traits and reduced risk. A garden built on living continuity did not depend on seed availability to survive. Diversity was another critical feature. Medieval gardens were not monocultures. They combined perennial vegetables, annual crops, herbs, fruit trees, and medicinal plants in close proximity. This diversity spread risk across time and function. If one crop failed, others compensated. If weather disrupted planting, perennial foods still produced. This system proved its value repeatedly. During famines, monastery gardens often continued to feed people when surrounding fields failed. Their strength did not come from higher yields in good years, but from consistency in bad ones. The garden acted as a buffer against chaos. Importantly, these systems did not rely on advanced technology. They relied on observation, patience, and memory. Knowledge was passed down because the garden itself persisted. You cannot learn how a plant behaves over 10 or 20 years if it is replaced every season. Continuity allowed understanding to deepen. Modern agriculture often assumes that progress means faster cycles and greater control. Medieval systems assumed progress meant fewer interventions over time. Their success was measured not by output per acre in a single season, but by how long food could be produced without rebuilding the system. This is the key difference. Medieval gardens were designed to mature. Modern gardens are designed to reset. When long-lived vegetables disappeared, it was not because they failed within this system. It was because the system itself was replaced by one that no longer valued endurance. The medieval garden system made replanting unnecessary for much of Europe's food supply. That achievement did not fit the priorities of the world that followed. Understanding this system is essential because without it, the crops themselves seem like anomalies. With it, they make perfect sense. They were not exceptions. They were the logical outcome of a food system designed to last. Within the medieval garden system, certain vegetables earned a special status. They were not rotated out, replaced, or treated as temporary solutions. They were planted with the understanding that they would remain, sometimes for the rest of a person's life, and often beyond it. These crops formed the nutritional backbone of everyday survival, precisely because they refused to disappear. The first of these was asparagus. When medieval farmers planted asparagus, they did so knowing they would wait. The plant demanded patience in its early years, sending energy downward rather than upward. But once established, it returned every spring for decades. Beds planted by one generation routinely fed the next. This was not seen as extraordinary. It was the expected behavior of a properly chosen crop. Asparagus provided early-season food when little else was available, making it invaluable after long winters. Alongside asparagus grew perennial greens such as good King Henry. Before spinach became fashionable, this plant was a staple across much of Europe. It emerged early in spring, produced leaves through much of the growing season, and returned year after year without reseeding. Its young shoots were eaten like asparagus, its leaves like spinach, and its flowering tops like broccoli. One plant provided multiple harvests annually, and it did so for decades. That versatility made it a household crop rather than a specialty. Lovage served a different, but equally important function. It was not just food, but flavor infrastructure. A single plant, once established, could season meals for an entire household for many years. Its leaves flavored soups and stews, its stems were eaten, its seeds used in baking, and its roots valued medicinally. Because it returned reliably, it reduced dependence on salt, imported spices, and preserved foods. In a medieval diet, flavor mattered not just for pleasure, but for making limited ingredients satisfying. Root crops played a crucial role as well. Skirret, now largely forgotten, was once prized across Europe. It produced clusters of sweet roots that could be harvested selectively, leaving the plant alive to regenerate. Unlike annual root vegetables, skirret did not require reseeding. It could be left in the ground through winter and dug as needed. In a time before refrigeration, this made it a living storage system, fresh food waiting underground. Rhubarb offered another form of endurance. Once planted, it became almost permanent. It died back in winter and returned stronger each spring, often outliving the person who planted it. Medieval Europeans initially valued it for medicinal use, but later embraced its edible stalks. A mature rhubarb plant produced large harvests year after year with minimal care. It tolerated neglect, cold, and poor conditions better than many annual crops. Artichokes introduced the concept of renewal without reseeding. Individual plants produced edible buds for several years before declining, but they also produced offsets, new plants emerging from the base. Gardeners simply divided these and replanted them. In this way, one original planting could be perpetuated indefinitely. The crop never truly ended. It was renewed through knowledge rather than purchase. Finally, horseradish represented persistence taken to its extreme. Once planted, it was nearly impossible to remove. Any piece of root left behind could regenerate. Medieval gardeners valued this tenacity. Horseradish thrived in poor soil, shade, and neglect. It provided pungent roots year after year with almost no input. In uncertain conditions, a plant that refused to die was a gift. What united these 7 crops was not appearance or taste, but behavior. They returned. They endured. They reduced the need for seeds, labor, and outside inputs. They turned gardens into systems that improved with time instead of exhausting themselves. These vegetables were not rare exceptions. They were widely grown because they worked. They fed families through years of hardship and stability alike. Their presence allowed medieval farmers to build food systems that did not collapse when conditions were less than ideal. When these crops formed the foundation of agriculture, replanting every year was unnecessary for much of the food supply. Seeds were used strategically, not compulsively. Replacement was the exception, not the rule. Understanding these crops is essential because they reveal something modern assumptions obscure. Food systems once relied on plants that behaved more like orchards than annual fields. They were planted with intention, maintained with knowledge, and trusted to return. Their disappearance was not a matter of biology. It was a matter of priorities. And that shift, from endurance to replacement, is what the next chapter begins to unravel. The disappearance of these 7 crops was not caused by failure in the field. They did not stop growing. They did not lose their nutritional value. They did not suddenly become impractical. What changed was the system around them. As Europe moved out of the medieval world and into early modern and industrial agriculture, the priorities that had once favored endurance were quietly replaced by priorities that rewarded speed, uniformity, and replacement. For centuries, agriculture had been organized around survival. The goal was continuity, food that returned reliably even when conditions were harsh. But as markets expanded and farming became increasingly commercial, food production shifted from sustaining households to supplying trade. Once crops were grown primarily for sale rather than survival, the logic changed. Predictable cycles became more important than long-term resilience. Fields needed to be cleared, replanted, and measured within a single year. Crops that did not reset cleanly became inconvenient. Perennial vegetables conflicted with this new rhythm. They occupied land continuously. They matured unevenly. They did not conform to tidy planting and harvesting schedules. From an industrial perspective, they were inefficient, not because they produced less food, but because they resisted control. A plant that stayed in the ground for decades could not be easily rotated, mechanized, or standardized. It demanded patience and observation instead of inputs and schedules. Annual crops, by contrast, fit the emerging system perfectly. They could be planted on command, harvested all at once, and removed completely. Fields could be replanned every year based on market demand. Inputs could be calculated precisely. Profit could be projected. Most importantly, annual systems created repeat demand. Seeds had to be acquired again. Fertility had to be replaced. The cycle sustained itself economically, even if it depleted soil and labor over time. Seed catalogs played a critical role in this transition. As seeds became commercial products rather than shared resources, crops that required annual reseeding became ideal. A farmer who planted annual spinach or cabbage needed new seed every year. A farmer who planted good King Henry once did not. Over time, catalogs stopped listing long-lived vegetables, not because they failed, but because they did not generate repeat sales. What was not sold was not taught. What was not taught was forgotten. Agricultural education followed the same path. Research focused on crops that could be bred quickly, patented, and replaced easily. Perennials, which change slowly and resist standardization, attracted little investment. Extension services promoted methods compatible with machinery and chemicals. Long-lived vegetables, which relied on time rather than technology, fell outside the framework of modern agriculture. Cultural attitudes shifted alongside economics. Waiting became synonymous with inefficiency. A plant that took several years to reach full production was labeled impractical, regardless of how much it produced over its lifetime. The idea of planting something you might not personally harvest came to be seen as outdated. Time horizons collapsed from generations to seasons. None of this required deliberate suppression. The crops were not outlawed. They were simply sidelined. Gardens were redesigned. Knowledge stopped being passed down. Skills like division and long-term plant care faded because they were no longer needed in systems built on replacement. Within a few generations, vegetables that had once fed Europe for centuries became obscure names or forgotten entirely. What makes this shift so difficult to recognize is that it felt like progress. Faster growth, cleaner fields, more control. But beneath that appearance, resilience was being traded for speed. Systems became more productive in the short term and more fragile in the long term. The disappearance of perennial vegetables was not an accident of history. It was the predictable outcome of an agricultural system that no longer valued permanence. Crops that refused to reset challenged the assumption that food production should depend on constant replacement. In the medieval world, that refusal was a strength. In the modern world, it became a liability. These crops did not disappear because they failed to feed people. They disappeared because they fed people too well without requiring ongoing transactions. Their endurance made them incompatible with a system organized around turnover. Understanding this is essential because it reveals a deeper truth. What was lost was not knowledge of how to grow these vegetables, but the willingness to design food systems that allow them to matter. When Europe moved away from crops that returned on their own, the loss was not dramatic. Harvests did not suddenly fail. Markets did not collapse overnight. Food continued to appear on tables. That is why the change went largely unnoticed. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Agriculture stopped accumulating strength and began consuming it. The first loss was resilience. Perennial crops acted as anchors in the food system. They returned regardless of missed plantings, labor shortages, or disrupted seasons. When these crops disappeared, food production became dependent on precision. Plant at the wrong time and the year is lost. Miss access to seed or fertilizer and the system stalls. Stability gave way to timing, and timing is fragile. Soil paid the next price. Long-lived vegetables protect soil continuously. Their roots hold structure, reduce erosion, and feed underground life year after year. Annual systems disturb soil repeatedly, clearing, tilling, replanting. Each disturbance breaks structure and exposes nutrients to loss. Over time, fertility declines and must be replaced artificially. What had once been maintained biologically became something imported and purchased. Soil stopped being a living foundation and became a problem to manage. Labor increased even as technology advanced. Perennial systems front-load effort and then reduce it. Annual systems erase progress. Every season demands the same work again: preparation, planting, correction, recovery. Nothing compounds. Effort resets. This repetition was reframed as efficiency, but in practice it meant more work for the same stability. Knowledge eroded alongside this shift. Managing perennial crops requires observation over years. You learn how plants respond to seasons, when to divide, how much to harvest without weakening them. These skills disappear when replacement becomes the default. Why learn to maintain when you can replace? Over time, understanding was replaced by instructions and experience by packaging. Diversity narrowed. Perennial vegetables were often locally adapted, shaped by generations of observation. When agriculture standardized around annual varieties, that diversity faded. Uniform crops simplified management in ideal conditions, but increased vulnerability under stress. When disease, drought, or climate irregularities appeared, systems failed more dramatically. The old gardens absorbed shock because they were varied. The new ones required control to survive. Perhaps the most subtle loss was psychological. Perennial systems teach continuity. They demonstrate that care accumulates, that time can be an ally. Annual systems teach impermanence. Everything is temporary. Everything must be restarted. Loss becomes normal because it is expected. When collapse is built into the cycle, resilience feels unattainable. Independence also declined. A garden that cannot reproduce itself ties its survival to external systems. Seeds, fertilizers, and replacements become necessities rather than options. Food production becomes vulnerable to market disruptions and supply chains. What once provided security now mirrors the instability of the broader economy. This dependency did not arrive through force. It arrived through convenience. Each step seemed reasonable. Faster crops, cleaner fields, predictable schedules. But taken together, these choices dismantled a system that had quietly supported Europe for centuries. Replanting became normal not because it worked better, but because it aligned with systems built on turnover and consumption. The irony is that modern agriculture often works harder to achieve less stability. More inputs, more effort, more complexity, yet greater vulnerability. The medieval systems that were abandoned did not promise ease. Life was hard. Yields were sometimes lower in the short term. But the systems themselves improved with time. What was lost was not simply a set of crops. It was a different relationship with time. Medieval agriculture assumed that today's work should make tomorrow easier. Modern agriculture often does the opposite, borrowing against the future to maintain the present. When replanting became normal, starting over stopped feeling like a cost. It became an expectation. And once that expectation took hold, the idea that food could return on its own, without being asked, bought, or replaced, began to feel unrealistic. Yet for 800 years, that return was exactly what sustained Europe. For a long time, the disappearance of these medieval crops felt final. The systems that replaced them seemed permanent, and the idea that vegetables could feed people for decades without replanting sounded unrealistic in a modern world. But conditions have changed. Quietly, steadily, the assumptions that once erased these crops are beginning to crack. The first pressure is economic. Growing food has become expensive in ways previous generations never experienced. Seeds must be purchased every year. Fertilizers and soil amendments are increasingly costly. Water, tools, and infrastructure demand constant investment. For many growers, the math no longer makes sense. Each season requires more inputs just to maintain the same output. In that environment, crops that reduce repetition are no longer curiosities, they are relief. Soil exhaustion has made the problem harder to ignore. Decades of annual disturbance have stripped many soils of structure and life. The response has been to add more inputs, but those inputs treat symptoms rather than causes. Perennial vegetables offer a different approach. Their roots remain in place year-round, feeding soil organisms, stabilizing structure, and rebuilding fertility slowly but persistently. As soil health becomes harder to maintain through products alone, biology is regaining importance. Climate instability has accelerated this shift. Food systems that rely on precise timing struggle when seasons behave unpredictably. Late frosts, heat waves, droughts, and irregular rainfall can wipe out entire annual plantings in a matter of days. Perennial crops, already established and adapted to their environment, absorb these disruptions more effectively. They do not need to be replanted into chaos. They persist through it. There is also a cultural change underway. More people are questioning systems that require constant consumption to function. The idea that food production should become easier with time, not harder, is resurfacing. Long-lived vegetables align naturally with this mindset. They reward patience instead of urgency. They offer continuity in a world built on replacement. Information has played a critical role in this rediscovery. Knowledge that once survived only in obscure texts, monastery records, or isolated gardens is now accessible again. Gardeners are sharing experiences, experimenting with forgotten crops, and relearning skills like division, cuttings, and long-term plant care. What was once rare is becoming visible. Importantly, this return is not about rejecting modern agriculture entirely. Medieval systems were not perfect. Labor was hard. Yields were sometimes lower in the short term. But the principle they relied on, building systems that improve with time, remains sound. The future of food does not lie in choosing between past and present, but in combining endurance with knowledge. Reintroducing even one perennial crop changes the rhythm of a garden. It creates a foundation that does not need to be rebuilt every year. That foundation reduces pressure. Mistakes matter less. Missed plantings are not catastrophic. The system becomes forgiving. Over time, confidence replaces urgency. This shift also restores a quiet form of independence. Fewer purchases are required. Fewer emergencies arise. The grower becomes less exposed to market fluctuations and supply disruptions. Food production begins to feel stable rather than precarious. What makes these crops powerful today is the same thing that made them powerful centuries ago. They reduce dependency. They turn time into an asset rather than a liability. They allow effort to accumulate instead of resetting. The system that erased them did so because permanence did not fit its logic. That logic, built on turnover, replacement, and constant input, is now showing its limits. As those limits become harder to ignore, the value of endurance becomes clear again. These crops matter now not because they are old, but because they solve modern problems without requiring modern complexity. They do not promise perfection. They promise continuity. Planting a crop meant to last is a different kind of decision. It is not about maximizing this season's yield. It is about reducing future vulnerability. It is about choosing systems that grow stronger with time rather than weaker. For 800 years, Europe relied on vegetables that returned without being replanted. That history matters not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Evidence that food systems can endure without constant replacement. Evidence that permanence is not only possible, but practical. What was erased can be grown again. And in a world increasingly defined by instability, the quiet strength of these crops may be exactly what is needed. Not to go backward, but to move forward with roots deep enough to last.